Tonight, I want to give you an insight into what life was like in our workhouse, why it was in a small village like Yardley, and what impact it had on the village. I'll be using extracts from newspapers and minute books of the time. Bear with me, I've got quite a lot of information. I might lose my place, so you might, yeah.
Great.
So this is a painting of it, and this is what it would have looked like at the time that we're talking about it. Now that central building's down. Right, so it all starts with the Poor Law Amendment Act. It was taking poor relief from local level to a centralised system. Care for the poor had become very haphazard and something needed to be done. So the law planned to group parishes together into unions. This cartoon shows the worries at the time, as it was thought of being much harsher than usual, than it had been before. This is the Duke of Grafton, and he played a big part in the establishment of Workhouse. As soon as the law had reached royal assent, the Duke of Grafton's agent told the Poor Law Commissioners that a new central poor house was about to be built at the Duke's expense to serve Potterspury, Grafton and Alderton. The Duke thought this would perfectly form a union, saying, "The parishes are all agricultural and there is a super abundant poor population." He had to persuade them quite a lot to accept his idea of having a union, because they'd envisaged their unions in much larger towns and larger villages. And the Dukes of Grafton at that time lived in Wakefield Lodge, and the Duke insisted that the workhouse should be in the centre of his lands. And so in 1835, it was started, and it was actually the first in the county. And the workhouse was converted from existing buildings in Yardley that belonged to the Duke. And here's a plan here, a very early plan of it, and you can see the Duke of Grafton's lands are all around it. And here's the Stony Stratford Road is over here, Northampton, Stony Stratford, and all of that area, including that garden. I'm not quite sure of the date of that plan, but it shows that he had the land that was all around it. So it was set up with 4 districts, and all of them it was right in the centre of his land. There were 11 Northamptonshire parishes and 3 from North Bucks. So you can see Wolverton, Stony, Potterspury, Yardley. When they say 11, it was because Yardley Gobion was actually part of Potterspury parish. So even though there are 12 names there, Potterspury and Grafton at that end. So we're just going to have a quick look at the administration. This would have been the same all over the country that they'd set up in the Poor Law thing. So at national level, you had the Poor Law Commissioners, who later became the Poor Law Board and the Local Government Board, and finally the Ministry of Health. That's probably changed now. It's probably not called the Ministry of Health, but it was when we did the last one. And the union was composed of a board of guardians, and the guardians were elected local ratepayers from each parish, occupying property worth at least £25 a year, and 2 of the board would be visiting committee, and they visited each week to check that everything was running smoothly. And there was also a clerk, treasurer, relieving officer and a district medical officer. And the Board of Guardians in 1861 already have some names that we know of in Yardley. So there was a Weston, and also a scrivener would have been a Yardley person. And they would have been representing all of the other parishes as well. Right, this is the clerk. He organised the meetings, took minutes, kept accounts, and submitted reports. And he had this was the salary in 1853. And here's a sample of his work. This is a minute book from that time. Very, everything in it. I think I can see just about there something about the common fund account. That was what the parishes had to pay into a common fund. These minute books are in Aylesbury, actually, at the record office there. And we've only looked at them up to about the 1860s. So there's a nice little job for someone who would like to go over there and dig them out and do the research for the rest of the time that we haven't yet looked at. And the relieving officer, he was the most highly paid, and he examined all the applications for poor relief, visited, assessed, presented his weekly accounts, enforced nuisance acts and vaccination acts. Nuisance acts were when there were problems, I think it was more problems actually with sewage and things like that, anything like that that he had to do. And I think he must have walked in between the parishes, because in 58 it was suggested that it would be the propriety of the relieving officer being required to keep a horse, and they thought it was necessary for him to do so. This was proposed that this poor man, who was probably still walking in between the parishes, could have it. Proposed, seconded, but someone thought it not necessary for him to do so, and the amendment was carried. So he was still walking around in between the parishes, I presume. And here he was reporting about out relief and giving his report. And the Duke of Grafton, after all that, thought that each guardian might inquire into the cases of very old recipients of outreach and to report to the board with a view of augmenting the weekly allowance. The Duke of Grafton was an ex officio member of the guardians each time. And we had medical officers. The photographs, of course, aren't actually from our workhouse, but they give a good impression of the of what was going on at that time. And this is an advertisement for the medical officer, that each medical officer will be allowed for each case of midwifery, which he shall be called to attend, the sum of £25. And then there's another interesting little bit at the bottom, which says to supply all necessary medicines and appliances, except trusses, for which he will be paid cost price, including carriage. So we have to read through these Victorian advertisements and try and work out what they're actually trying to say. And also what they were actually giving people who were ill, because the workhouse medical officer made this report. The children, both male and female, having been much troubled with cutaneous eruptions for some months, I beg to recommend that they have unsalted meat 5 times a week. Mutton will be preferable, and suet puddings. Well, I'm not 100% sure what they were trying to cure with that, but still. And also in 1840, there was a smallpox vaccination program, but surprisingly, and at the present time, there was some reluctance to take it up. which sounds rather familiar at the moment, but it was made compulsory in 1853. Yardley's workhouse also had its own problem with measles during 1842. There were at least 45 cases within the workhouse and no less than 5 fatalities from the disease. The guardians rewarded the master and matron for their contribution in comforting the inmates during the measles epidemic with an award of £5. Again, a reward for their care. Now we have a complaint against the doctor, not the same doctor, but one of the doctors, that he did not attend the husband of Mary Brooks, and his excuse to her was that he never attended anyone in the afternoon. So, and again, here's the nuisance removal and diseases, no symptoms of cholera. That's what they were really checking for the nuisances removal, the health of the place, and there were no symptoms of cholera. Right, so now we're coming down through the administration. That was all union, and we're coming now to the workhouse itself, which would have had a master, matron, and a schoolmaster and schoolmistress, or just one schoolmistress. And here's a picture of a typical master and his staff, probably slightly bigger than our workhouse because there's quite a few people there. And he got £10 a quarter. Work was found, if possible, for the younger inmates. And here's a poor Louisa Green, who had to return to the workhouse. She'd been sent to Stony Stratford as probably as a maid in the excise officers, whatever it was anyway. And in consequence of her master having attempted to take improper liberties with her, and she came before the meeting and explained the circumstances. Sometimes they had managed to find apprenticeships for the boys, and the girls went into service. But like for Louisa, it didn't always work. Excuse me. But Mr. Sharp, the master, accompanied one boy to Devon to go on the HMS Victory.
Interesting.
And here's a matron. This was normally, the master and matron were usually a couple, and that's some of the things they might be doing. And here's an advertisement. The Potterspury Union Workhouse wanted at the workhouse. The master must be a good accountant, and references as to capability and character will be required to be produced. Oh, thank you. The salary for both situations will be with 3 rations per day each. So they were given their food as well. And they would have to present themselves to the board at their meeting in the Yardley Workhouse. And schoolmasters and schoolmistresses, the master got £5 a quarter. Here's a report from the Inspector of Schools from his last visit to the workhouse. And this is quite interesting. You can see it yourselves, but I'll just read it. I've examined the children and find that the young ones are fairly instructed as their circumstances permit. The elder boys, except one named Robertson, do not make any perceptible progress, which the schoolmistress states to be occasioned by their being much occupied during school hours in the cultivation of the land, so that they do not receive in summer the 3 hours daily instruction required. So at first, the the schoolroom was in the workhouse, but towards the end of the 19th century, it was realised that it was a bad thing to keep workhouse children shut up, as they had difficulty in facing life in the outside world when they were old enough to go out to work. So they began to attend the village school, and at that time the doorway was cut through the wall, joining the workhouse and the school playground. The school logbook actually has some details of the Union children. 2 Union boys left the playground during recreation without permission, and Ernie Cross was punished for burning a duster. So I'm not sure how well they actually settled into it. I wanted to finish the school section with these pictures. I've got 2 pictures of the May Day celebrations. Every year in Yardley in the 1900s, early 1900s, and perhaps previously, I'm not sure, they had a May Day extravaganza almost. It was real, really exciting for the whole village. And it was an annual event and very much reported in the local newspapers. The master of the workhouse was the chairman of the May Day committee. So I like to think that these last 2 pictures would have included children from the workhouse. Right, we're now going to go on and look at some of the tenders for food, clothes and other necessary items. These appeared in the local press, in the Northampton Mercury, Buckingham Advertiser, North Bucks-Free Press, that was, and the Buckingham Express. And there was even some things reported in the Bicester Express as well. And these are all available to look at on British newspapers online. Right, so they would tender for all these things, but they would also get some from the village. So these would be things perhaps that they couldn't find people to tender from in the village. And some interesting articles there. They've got their bacon and their starch and blue, candles and soap, black tea, soda, salt coals and meat. And they had to tender for that, and the lowest tender got the got the job. This is lovely. This was, when we first looked through these, this was one of our favourites. 52 pints of brandy, which were being supplied to sick paupers throughout the Union. 42 pints have been in the parishes of Potterspury and Grafton Regis out of 54 and a half. So our clerk is directed to find why, if there's any cause, why so much brandy is recommended to sick paupers. And you just have that little feeling that maybe it was being filtered off amongst, well, hopefully not the Board of Guardians, but somewhere along the line it wasn't actually getting to the sick paupers. And this one is, oh, and there was also a lovely bit and as well after the brandy. The cock at Stony and the reindeer at Potterspury had to bid for 4 gallons of good port wine for the outdoor sick poor, and they were to bring a sample along to the next meeting. So I have a feeling as well that might have just, the Guardians might have thought, this is rather good, let's have some of that as well. This is an extract from the clothing tender, and it shows you what they were actually wearing. And the first line, I just tell you what the fustian is. The men and boys' jackets and trousers, and it's thick, hard-wearing twilled cloth with short nap, usually dyed in dark colours, the coarse fustian of prison clothing. So they were actually wearing almost, well, very much like they would have worn if they'd been in prison. But the girls had check gowns, so that was quite nice. And then they had stockings, capes, women's brand, and at the bottom, bed ticking, because the actual beds usually were of straw. And I imagine the bed ticking is the is that sort of sheeting that you can get, or quite heavy sheeting that would have been to make the beds. Right, let's see how the village benefited from the workhouse. Right, village traders that are mentioned in the minutes are Jemima Smith for bread, James Weston for pigs, he was at the Red House, and John Mason. Toddy was the tailor, and Thomas Waugh was a shoemaker, and Shake Shafts made the coffins and did the burials, and the pack horse and the other local inns are mentioned. And Mrs. Jemima Smith was the supplier of bread to both the workhouse and the outdoor poor in 1842, and she was still making her deliveries in 1859 when she received a quarterly payment of no less than £188, 1 shilling and sixpence. So she definitely benefited from the workhouse being in the village, because I'm sure she wouldn't have made that sort of money if she hadn't. And also the poor in the village benefited greatly, because they didn't actually have to go into the workhouse. They were given their food in their homes, and so they avoided going into the workhouse. Right, let's see what the day-to-day advice from on high was for the people. Right, they segregated them into 7 classes: aged and infirm men, able-bodied men, and able-bodied women, and girls above 7 and under 16, children under 7. So they were all strictly segregated within the within it. And this would have been their daily routine. I think that all of these came from the poor law commissioners in London. It was part of what they had to actually look after. So what they had to do and follow. So half an hour after the workhouse bell was rung for rising, the master or matron performed a roll call in each section. And the bell also announced meal breaks, where they had to be silent, order and decorum shall be maintained. Although, interestingly, from 1842, the word silence was dropped. So I'm not quite sure if they just chatted through everything. So they, in the spring, they were at 6 o'clock from March to September, they had to get up, and 7 o'clock in the winter. And then they were going to bed. I can't see that actually because it's behind our pictures. 8 o'clock in the evening, they went to bed. So that was the recommended daily routine, as there were samples of different diets as well, recommended diets. But very interestingly, there is always beer at noon and night. And this is why I was so interested in the bottles that are being dug up at the beginning of Mount Pleasant on the left-hand side. They've been finding lots and lots of bottles. And I was hoping that they might be some beer bottles with a local brewery or something, but I think most of them are ginger beer bottles. So they had gruel. It all sounds a little bit Oliver Twisty, really, and peas pottage, meat and broth, hasty pudding, and barley broth, baked puddings. Actually, some of it doesn't sound too bad. It's the breakfast with the bread and beer that sounds a bit Perhaps that was only on Sundays they were
Only
allowed
on a
the
Sunday.
beer. Yes, it is. Only on Sunday they had their beer. Thursdays was a bad day because they had bread and gruel on a Thursday. And these are the forms that came. They had to fill in religious forms, saying when they'd been admitted, and then there was a burial form, and then this one at the on the far side is the admission and discharge form for the casual poor or vagrants or tramps, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. Right, the occupants, and they are called inmates. I can't say I like that word very much, but throughout everything, that's what they're saying. So we're going to have a look at the census now. Oh, I didn't actually say who the occupants were. The inmates were elderly and sick with no family, orphans, unmarried pregnant women who were disowned during and after birth, mentally ill and handicapped. And we're going to have a quick look at the census now, which shows that it never anywhere near reached its target of 200 people. It was never full, even though it was built for 200. It wasn't actually. Sometimes it was barely 100. And also, interestingly, it shows how few children were in there at the end. And actually, by 1911, it was more like, when I was looking at it and looking at the ages, it was almost more like an old people's home with a few younger people, but not quite so many. Particularly interesting in the 1911 census is that it numbers the room as 6 in the infirmary, 30 in the workhouse, and 10 in the tramps ward. The tramps who come that night, because that's what they did, the tramps actually came into the workhouse for the night, and I've got a little bit more about that in a minute. The tramps who are on that census in 1911 were from as far apart as Bolton, Birmingham, and Malta. Someone was Maltese on the census day. There were 9 of them. That's why there's a fairly big spike in the adults, because 9 of those were actually tramps. In the early censuses, there were mostly lace makers who were elderly and had probably lost their sight, so were unable to do lace making anymore, and elderly agricultural labourers. Other occupations included rag and bone gatherer, and the first railway labourer appears in 1891. But sadly, I find this quite sad, a lot of them were termed idiot, insane, or lunatic, which is rather sad. Another interesting thing to look at around and thinking about this is the contribution to the common fund, or how much the parishes gave. Ours stayed much the same because it was obviously per person, but not surprisingly, Wolverton went from £85 at the beginning to 456 towards the last the account that we've seen, and that was obviously because of the railway and the increase in population in Wolverton. Right, we're now going to look at some magisterial cases. These again are fully seen in the local press, and there are plenty of reports of problems with the inmates. This one here, the next one I'm going to show you, refusal to work. Jesse Atterbury, an inmate of the Union, brought up in custody, charged with refusing to do his allocated task and also with insulting the assistant matron. He was committed to 1 day's imprisonment. That was in the North Bucks Times and County Observer in 1890. George Hayes, I'm just trying to move these things up so I can actually see it. George Hayes, for 14 days hard labour for destroying his own clothes whilst an inmate in the Union Workhouse. He must have been pretty desperate to destroy his clothes. And just to show you that even the women had hard labour, Minnie was charged that while she was there, she did unlawfully misbehave herself and pleaded guilty. The assistant matron stated that on the 9th, she went to the prisoner and told her to go to her work. The prisoner refused to go, swore at her, smacked her face, and again she ordered her to work and was repeatedly refused. And the bad language, and used bad language, and she was committed for 7 days hard labour. That poor person called Jessie, the first one that we looked at a little while back, he actually was in the workhouse for over 10 years because he appears in 2 of the censuses. So, right now, the tramps, or as they called them, the casual poor. At first, there was a ward for them, and then they were transferred down to Stony because it was on a major road. They later came back to a newly built ward. And they wanted to appoint a police constable as an assistant relieving officer for the vagrants. And that, unfortunately, he hadn't been able to get any accommodation. But I think that quite quickly there was an actual police constable who was in charge of that as well. The casual ward was opened for the travellers could stay, and they could stay for 1 night. They used to arrive in the late afternoon and sit on the seat surrounding the elm tree on the green until the gate opened for them. They had to bathe then and change into clean workhouse clothes while their own were fumigated. And then they were given supper, a bed and breakfast. Following morning, they had to break a heap of large stones into smaller pieces, which were then subsequently used for road repairs. There's a good one here about lazy tramps. It was headlined Lazy Tramps. And these people, 3 of them of no fixed abode, were charged with refusing to work. And I like the comment that Flowers said. He was, James Flowers said, he told the master he would not break stones on bread and water. And they all were taken into custody and sentenced for 15 days imprisonment, each with hard labour. It's a bit sad, really. This is the tramps' entrance. Oh, I think I might have missed a nice photo, actually. If I can find it, I will just go back one. There.
You're right, thank you.
Can you see the bench round the base of the elm tree? Now they're just probably out looking at the procession that was going past here. But that was where they would wait. They'd sit there till 6 o'clock when they were allowed to go into the workhouse. And that's the tramps' entrance is actually where Carol lives now, actually. And it was it used to be our post office. And you can see, particularly from that picture as well, that the house went right across. There wasn't an entrance. You can see the 3 windows. I think that Jeff and Pam have got in their house. I think they've got 3 windows. And then that form of window went right further across. And the gap was only there when they were using them as houses. Okay, right, let's have a look now. if the tramps had any money with them, they would be terrified that it would be pinched while they were in the workhouse. So they used to hide it in the hedges and then go and collect it the next day on their way out after they were allowed out again. Right, I think it's time that we looked at some happier times, because that's been rather not quite so happy. So we're looking at happier times now. And I think I've enjoyed these extracts from the papers most because they're in this wonderful Victorian language that makes you really, yeah, anyway. The Duke of Grafton, this was the 5th Duke. He was a regular benefactor between 61 and 62 and provided, for example, a quantity of cloaks and coats for the paupers. So, and then following a government directive to improve conditions, they directed the master to provide a few comfortable seats and cushions and a flock bed, that would be instead of the straw bed, or 2 for the aged and sick. And the dining hall was repapered and repainted, and there was some outside repairs done as well. So this is the beginning of our. Then along comes the 6th Duke. Again, he was quite well involved. And I love this. A holiday was given by him in Whittlebury Forest to the inmates of the Potterspury Union Workhouse, the necessary funds having been cheerfully contributed by considerate and benevolent friends in the neighbourhood. And I'm going to just read a little bit more of that article because it relates to this wagon. Poor people assembled who thoroughly enjoyed themselves, testifying their joyousness by loudly hurrahing as they returned homewards in a wagon furnished by the farm bailiff of the Duke of Grafton. The enlivening strains of a small band, ably conducted by Mr. Bird of Deanshanger, led to dancing, even among the aged, and added much enjoyment to the day. It did actually well, I think he used to do it more every year, but that particular year, the weather wasn't very good. Right, let's see what this one is. Again, this is quite happy. This is a treat. A portion of the company of Stony Stratford, having recently been giving entertainments in the neighbourhood, gave a performance for the inmates of the Potterspury Union Workhouse, where there were several ladies from the neighbourhood present. The entertainment was well given, much appreciated, and the conclusion, a hearty vote of thanks was accorded. So they did have some fun as well. And again, this one in the newspaper, it had articles from each of the different areas that the newspaper covered, and they all were having something, an event for the royal wedding. And this was Prince George and the Princess Mary, who became George V. And the Duke of Grafton gave a tea to the children of Potterspury and Yardley Gobion, the old people over 60, and the inmates of the workhouse were invited. And on Thursday, they were allowed special fare instead of the ordinary diet. So that was a fun time. I just wish that we had a photograph of this. I really do. That's the only problem, that you don't have the photographs. There probably are some. We ought to ask Wolverton if they've got a history group that could dig out some photographs of the Wolverton Sunflower Minstrels who paid a visit. The entertainment consisted of songs, instrumental selections, jokes, stump peach. I shall ask afterwards if anyone actually knows what stump peach means. Mr. Hardwick thanked the troop on behalf of the inmates for the great amusement. I think that's lovely, the Wolverton Sunflower Minstrels, but we do need a photograph of them. And then Miss Capel from Passenham, they were entertained and provided with an excellent tea in the large day room on the women's side. The women and children from the body of the house were also invited, and the pleasant little gathering took place at 4:30. It's just little bits like that, the pleasant little gathering that is so Victorian and so I just love this. Another annual event was the Potterspury Flower Show, and the Duke of Grafton, with characteristic thoughtfulness, had the inmates of the Potterspury Union Workhouse conveyed to the show, maybe in a wagon like they'd gone to Whittlebury in. And that comes up every year in the local press. Now, Christmas at the Workhouse, and we'll recognise another name as we go through this, another Yardley name. It was a fitting manner, good things provided. Mr. H.T.F. Weston, Guardian and District Councillor, assisted in the carving according to his usual custom, and the Reverend and Mrs. Goldberg also assisted. I don't know if the Goldbergs were Potterspury or Yardley. In the afternoon, Reverend Mrs. Plant visited, so I think it was a Potterspury and a Yardley person, visited the house and the infirmary and sang carols. Right, now have I gone on? I have gone on one more again. And I had to put this in because this is quite a famous picture, and it's got the wonderful little, I'll just read the first bit. It is Christmas Day at the Workhouse, and the cold bare walls are bright with garlands of green and holly, and the place is a pleasant sight. For with clean washed hands and faces, in a long and hungry line, the paupers sit at the tables, for this is the hour they dine. And that is quite a famous one, but it seems to sum up perhaps what it was like in Yardley as well at that time. Right, we're almost, I think we're coming a little bit towards the end of it. Right, now, people who are here from Mount Pleasant, this might be your home. Right, a new wing has been added to Potterspury Union Workhouse, containing 2 day rooms and 2 dormitories. The work is of local red brick with Bath stone dressings and string courses. The roofs are of Bangor slate. They wanted to build it with stone from the Duke of Grafton's pits in Potterspury, but he said that they hadn't enough to cover it, to do it. And I think when we move on, you'll know if it's yours, and I should be very interested to know if anybody's in this one. Right. So it was built in April 1871, or that was when the tender came in. £529 tender for the building being the lowest, and that was accepted. And this one at this end of as you look up into Mount Pleasant to the houses at the end, it's the only one that still shows the string courses and the other bits there, and the string courses, which the others have been whitewashed, so that's the original there. And that's just another old view of Mount Pleasant. But this was much later. This was probably, I don't know, this is probably when they already were, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. Now here we've got an annotated map which shows you where they actually were. So the women were all on this side and the men on this side. That round thing was the master's accommodation, the bit that was in the middle. This is looking up towards, this is the main road, the high street in Yardley. No, it's not. Sorry. I do apologise. This is the high street here with the tramps entrance and the house going right across, and that was the committee room downstairs for the, and all the business part. And then upstairs there were the illegitimate babies and mothers upstairs there. And the little bungalow at the end is the laundry. And this was the new area that we just looked at, the red brick one, with a schoolroom and teachers' living accommodation at that time, and later a hospital for wounded soldiers at the top. And right, in 1917, the master's wife died and he wanted to retire, and it was decided to temporarily close the workhouse during the war. Part of the workhouse was used as a hospital for wounded soldiers, and then in 1918 it became a prisoner of war camp for German soldiers working on local farms. After the war, the contents were auctioned and 100 iron bedsteads made up to 14 shillings. But it never operated as a workhouse after that. And here we've got one of the artifacts that I think are one of the very interesting things. And I'm going to ask Melinda to tell you about that after I've finished. It's a postcard, a German postcard, found under the upstairs floorboards in number 10. And it's lovely. It's a lovely thing to have. I think it's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Okay. Oh, I forgot to say that one of those guards stayed here and married someone in the village, one of the guards that we were looking at, the prisoner of war guards. We did see those, didn't we? And he married Marjorie Shapeshaft. Did I flick through that, or did we see them? I think we saw the guards. Okay, and this could be the last picture. Oh, finally, today. Right, so I wonder how you feel they were treated. I feel that generally, looking through the minute books, you get a feeling that it was administered fairly, providing, of course, you didn't smack the matron across the face or set your clothes on fire, like those that we mentioned. And all the Dukes of Grafton seem to take an interest in it. And there's masses more to actually investigate. So I'm hoping that perhaps somebody will continue looking through the newspapers and continue the last bit of it through to when it was actually sold as housing. And you can still see the basic shape there, and the latest, those red brick houses at the end.
Brilliant.
Okay, Robert, I think I finished. Yeah, I think I have.
Thank you very
so much,
Barbara. Barbara would care.
I'll stop my sharing.
Thank you.
There you go. Oops.
Right. Now, I'm not going to immediately unshare you all. There's at least one hand up, which I will take in a moment, unless, I tell you what, I'll take Joe and Ian right away, if I may. If you'd care to unmute yourself a moment, or I can do it, or ask you to do it. Would you like to share your part or your question?
Well, actually, I was just saying thank you. That was fantastic.
Got that far yet?
I'm just interested to see that actually how Paul and Kerry have got the house next, because we're the White House next to Paul and Kerry's, which is still the brick and dressed house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Taking it right back to how it should be, and we would love to do that too, but very expensive. We've had a quote, can't afford it.
One day.
Yeah.
Well, I was pleased when I walked up and found that one was still red brick.
Lovely. But if you look at the plans, you'll see that it's in a T shape, isn't it? And I think there was a bit at the front actually that's not there anymore.
Yes.
The entrance. And I think if we did try to take it back to the brick, we'd find that actually there's rendering there anyway. A bit of an at the front. So yeah, we have had a quote, but it's too expensive. Can't afford it.
Well, thank you, Joe, for that extra bit of insight. Maggie has a hand up, and maybe Steve, but if you care to unmute yourself, or I will ask you to unmute.
It is me, yes. Barbara it was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. Barbara talked about the vicar called Plant. He was from Potterspury. There's lots of pictures in the Potterspury book of the Reverend Plant. He usually wears a very nice flat hat. And Goldberg was his curate, I believe.
Oh, right.
But the person to give you that more definitely would be probably David Marks. He would tell you much more straightforwardly than I could. But because he knows more about the details of that. But yeah, I'm sure Goldberg, despite the name, was his curate.
Lovely.
Can I, while we're on, can I just ask and say something?
Please do, Maggie.
I think workhouses, it always sounded awful, but they did save people from lives of penury, really.
Yes.
And probably saved a lot of lives. And it was sometimes a relief for people to get into the workhouse where they would have, they'd be kept, they'd be clothed and fed. But do you know, Barbara, what sort of work they did?
Well, I think the ones that where they were saying the children were working, they had quite a large garden around it. I haven't found out that they worked on the farms because I wondered if they did actually harvest time and things like that. I think I haven't really looked into that, but I was wondering if they were, helped on farms at certain times.
I dare say they did, because it was all hands on deck, wasn't it? And I certainly know the children from Potterspury School, which would include some Yardley children.
Yes.
They would go out, blackberrying and picking rose hips. There'd just be days off from school and they'd be employed doing that.
Yeah.
So they would probably probably.
I haven't found
workhouse as well.
I haven't found any information about actually what they did, what work the men and the women did in there. I think the women did all the sewing and the laundry and everything like that. Yeah. And generally looking after
cooking, wouldn't there? There'd be
cooking and all that.
That big pile of rock. Was that generally part of what they did anyhow?
Yes, that was what they did. And they did something called oakum picking. I'm not quite sure what that is.
Oh, I think Rob knows about oakum.
Well, I do know about oakum. But that's definitely a...
We both know about oakum.
That's definitely a subject for another evening. But
don't get him started.
No, all right. I will just very quickly tell you. Oakum is basically a hemp which was created into a type of rope, but a very crude rope, which was used for the caulking of wooden narrowboat hulls. So basically, if you have a wooden boat with just planks, it'll leak. But if you caulk it with hemp and the like, Holcomb can create that. Can I just take, while I've got the sort of the screen, just one moment. Can I just mention a couple of questions which will come up now? If you do want to speak, particularly when your questions come up, if you hold your space bar, that will let you unmute, or you can click the appropriate button on the bottom of your screen or wherever it is on an iPad. But Carol on her iPhone asked, you mentioned the tramps were sent to Stony. Do you know where? Was there?
I don't know where, but I'm sure probably we could find out.
Okay.
Easily, either in the minutes. I think that would be the best place. But of course, you have to go to Aylesbury for that. I don't know if it would be anything that was the newspaper thing that I use is called British Newspapers Online, and I have a year's subscription to that.
Good.
And that is absolutely fascinating. A real hobby.
Thank you. A couple of people have commented about stump speech.
Oh, yes.
Tracy, first of all, says comic monologue.
All right, yeah.
Linda, I'm sorry if I'm not using the right person's name, if they happen to have come up on my screen as that, but I'm sure it is Linda. A stump speech had political overtones, which is interesting, particularly in the setting of the workhouse. And Tracy then came back and said it was a precursor to modern day stand-up comedy.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, Luke's asked a question which, had I got the opportunity, I would have asked, but I can ask you on his behalf. But obviously the houses, he asked, any idea why there are now gaps in the buildings on the right-hand side of Mount Pleasant? So as you look up Mount Pleasant, those houses there, are semi-detached houses. Do you know why there are gaps in them now?
I'm really sorry, I don't know, but I don't know if anyone else does.
Right, well, I'm looking for any help on that one. If
Linda
we
knows,
can, please raise a hand, although I do have some of your hands covered at the moment. No, they're not.
Belinda's going to answer that.
All right, well done, Luke. You're in good company there by three of us requiring the answer.
And Melinda's going to tell us about that card, actually, Robert. If she
Well, I was just going to ask her in just one moment. Can I go down? There's sorry, somebody else has, Paul has asked that. Right, Oakham picking was pulling apart old rope for caulking, which is just what we've covered, and Linda has said that it probably was done when it was converted to private housing. One of the residents of one of those houses some years ago, I can't even remember the numbers because I can never remember how the numbers in Mount Pleasant go, but allowed me to see up into his roof space, and there was definitely a lot of old timbers, and then there had been at the end of the gable some shoring up with more modern timbers. Now I take it there must have been a decision to split the houses, but they're obviously the same structures, I believe, underneath. So an interesting point. I mean, on the same front, or the same style of question, the residents that live down on the left-hand side, of which I know we've probably got nearly a full house of them tonight, is there links between your attics in any way? Have they all been bricked up? And are they solid now to help? Perhaps Les might take that one, or Mike.
Yeah, they are bricked up, but really badly. So they won't be fireproof. Put it like that. I can go through to next door to Paul's fairly easily. So yeah, we can shake hands in a COVID safe way at the moment. But yeah, so there's been an attempt to brick them up and separate them. But there used to be corridor upstairs, definitely, and I think this is both sides. So we've got in our upstairs right-hand side bedroom what would have been a doorway into Paul's next door, and I think, not having lived here that long compared to some people,
20 years.
I think that goes all the way up, and I think on the other side it's on the front of the houses as well, so there would have been a corridor.
I'm sorry, I'm just sitting here in my office with the rest of you in your armchairs and that, and there's Mike actually sitting in the room that we've been talking about.
Yes.
I mean, that is pretty incredible, really. When he raised his hand like that, I thought, yeah, I mean, I know Joe and Ian are the same. I know Les and Linda are, but I mean, you know, it's a pretty unique situation to have this in our own village. People actually talking to us from within the very building that's been the subject of our discussion this evening. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Can I come back to Linda and Les to just pick up on this story of the postcard, how you found it and what you found out about it, please, Linda?
Yes, when I moved here in 1982, this particular cottage had been empty for about 2 or 3 years. So it was in a semi-derelict state, and there was a ceiling attached to these beams. And it was very brown and very saggy, so we had to pull it down. And the postcard actually came down with the ceiling. So I would imagine that somebody had popped it in the cracks in the floorboards upstairs, along with, I think it was prisoner of war issue writing paper. There was a little area for the stamp to go. And on those little writing paper books were card scores. So I would imagine the prisoners of war were playing cards and writing their scores down. And all this came down with the ceiling, and we managed to find it amongst all the rubble. And I used to work at Plessey Microsystems, and there was a German guy there who was able to translate the postcard for me. It's written in very old spidery writing, very old German, but it was basically I think it was best wishes for the new year. I'm expecting you home around Boxing Day, something like that, the translation.
It was from his sister, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the prisoner of war was called Albert Schultz, and it was a card from his sister in Germany. And yeah, it was 1918, I think, the date, the postmark on the card. And I've got a theory about the breaks in the houses.
One other thing, though, before that, you've also found out recently that there were 50 prisoners of war up here in the First World War.
Yeah, I've never known a figure before, and I thought that there might have been sort of half a dozen or so. I was quite surprised when I read that there were 50 prisoners of war.
Interesting.
Yeah, the houses in the row opposite us. My theory is that we've got back access because we've got a private path that goes around the back. Houses, the red brick houses along the top, numbers 13 to 16, have got a public footpath behind them. Mm-hmm. But what was behind the row opposite us was the original road. And I think once the original road was then made into back gardens, there was no back access. Yeah. So I think 2 sections of the building were taken out to give side and back access to that side of the road. But that's just my theory. One other point, something I read about recently, is that I was surprised at the tramp population, how most of them had professions. There were blacksmiths and there were carpenters. There wasn't agricultural labourers. It was people with professions, which really surprised me. And they were the tramps, going from workhouse to workhouse. I don't know whether you read anything like that.
No, I haven't.
No,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Anyway, just a few other...
Thank you very much indeed, Linda, for that. Okay. That's really put some quite, I think very exciting and very useful background history to some of the people that were housed in the workhouse at that time. Excuse me. There's also a mention from Linda that when was it converted to private housing? So have you got a date for that, Barbara?
Well, I haven't got it actually written down near me at the moment, but I have got the details. Who was it? Who wanted to know?
I think that was Linda. I think Linda Llewellyn.
Oh, Linda Llewellyn.
I think. I'm pretty guessing. Yes, yeah. It was. Yes, it was.
I'll be able to tell her that.
Thank you. I've also got one more message. Luke says that the houses were not bricked up, that they were boarded up. When we were talking about the loft space and the divisions between each of the properties. Mike Dawkins, has anyone got the picture of the door in the wall going through from the school? I am sure I have seen this. I don't know if Barbara's got a comment on it.
I did ask my husband if he could find me one, but he couldn't find one for me.
Right. When the school was a school and the playground was accessible, even in the times when the school buildings were being converted to houses, the outline of the shape of that wall was quite clear. It was a different type of brick, obviously. I think the lintel might have been removed, but that was still there. It may now be possibly buried underneath the lovely shrubbery at the back of Linda's garden. It's that end of the wall, I believe, but anyway, so that's that one. I've got a couple more questions coming in as I speak. Helen is asking, you can see it from the other side of the, sorry, that's really saying, thank you, Helen. You can see it from the other side of what was the old school or school yard. And Sue is saying, I think this door is possibly at the back of my garage, number 17. So that all actually fits together rather nicely. I've got one other question for Barbara before I throw it over to if there's any more discussion on this subject tonight. In the records you have come across,
Yes.
you mentioned the burial register or the burial forms that were filled in.
Yes.
I mean, I'm speaking rather out of place, I suppose, here, because as most of you know, Helen, my wife, is one of the current church wardens. And does it have any details at all of their place of burial? Was this in the churchyard? Perhaps it was somewhere else. I don't think we've got that in the church records. We have made assumptions of where they are, and we just were wondering if any of the records you've come across.
I haven't come across any actual records of actual details. I'd only actually got that basic form which appears on the internet that's that they had within the workhouse system. Whether I don't know.
When I first came to the village, no, that's not quite true. When I first got involved with the earlier church wardens in terms of grass maintenance, the triangular area behind the War Memorial at the front of the church was relatively flat, apart from a couple of fairly hefty mounds just behind the War Memorial. And they told me, well, that's where the workhouse people were buried.
Mm.
Now, I've asked permission from them at the time if I could flatten them because they were a pain to mow round and over. But Helen will know my current thoughts on newer graves and mowing around them. But the thing is, if there were positive records, we would know. But bearing in mind the church building was only built in 1864, is an interesting one of some of the very first graves in the churchyard were to the left and the right. There are the large ornate graves that are there. While I've been speaking, there's at least one and possibly two more questions come in. I'm sorry, I'm not taking these in order. Was it possible, this is from Matthew, that the houses on the right of 17 to 20, the roof was lower than it is now? Is it possible the houses, the roof was lower than it was now? I hear what you say, because the roofs are considerably lower pitch than the other side of the Mount Pleasant.
Just so, sorry, I did state that because we recently had a damp inspector come and look, and he went up into the attic, and the chimney between us and number 19, you can actually see the structure where the roof used to be outlined. So he thinks that the roof was actually lifted at a certain point in time, where then it would make sense why our chimneys are shorter than the chimneys on the left-hand side.
Which confirms that when I looked in this, probably the same property about 25, 30 years ago, there was certainly some additional timbers, is all I can remember. Unfortunately, cameras you didn't carry with you in those days and photographs were not taken. But thanks very much indeed for that comment.
We can also see that in number 5 as well. So the house at the front, where our chimney is, we can see that there used to be a lower roof line than there is now, and we can see that the roof has been raised from where the chimney stack was. That's no longer on the end of the property. So it might suggest that it wasn't just on the left hand side, but actually potentially the whole roof line for the houses was slightly lower at one stage.
Thank you, most interesting. And that you also made the comment, sorry, I'm just picking that up, Georgie, that numbers 5 and 6 were whitewashed as well, so we can still see the remnants of that. Thank you. Okay, I've got, I don't think any more hands up. If, as I say, if anybody wants to make a comment, please feel free now to press your space bar or unmute yourself before you talk, but I think at the moment I'm going to say to Barbara many thanks for taking what was quite a lot of random information in the history group records, which we can't actually access at the moment because they are in the village hall, which we haven't been able to access. But also, you know, your research online is, if nothing else, time consuming, and to tease out the required bits of information I know takes a long time. And you know, I think we certainly, as chairman of the history group, I'd love to thank you personally, and I hope everybody else will join me in saying that. In doing that, Sue has also just raised her hand to me. Would you like to? Several comments are coming in, but please, if you do want to speak a minute, Mike's there with his hand up. No, you're just waving. I'm sorry. Paul is asked if Paul could just unmute a minute. He's got his hand up, or it's just a big thumb up. All right, that's great. Any further comments this evening from anybody? Can I therefore just go back to what I was saying just right at the very start? We have a history group planned meeting on, date has escaped me, I think it's the 6th of May. I'm just very quickly checking in my phone for that. I was also trying to actually work out, which is why my phone's not on my calendar, is to what £25 in 1853 is worth in today's money. That was the salary given to the is that the manager or the matron? I'm sure Barbara.
Master. Was it the master?
So if somebody's got their calculator handy, what's that value equivalent? I know everything's changed values, but if somebody's got that and can come up with it, great. By that stage, I shall just pick up my diary and say the 6th of May. At the moment, we haven't got a positive speaker. It has been suggested that we might well look back again at some of the great number of photographs we've got of the village taken at various times that we've acquired through postcards, through people's collections, and just have a friendly sort of, it may not be fireside in May, it may well be so hot and balmy there'll be people out on their patios and the like, but you know, this evening's been good to see so many of you, and you know, please keep your eye on Yardley Gobion Past and Present, which is our Facebook page, and we'll certainly nearer the time exactly what course that meeting would take. One other suggestion to me has been that I think Bruce Williams, who's not with us tonight, has shown a great deal of interest in Jeff's first of the bypass. Sorry, somebody's already coming up with me the figures. All of them here. £25 in 1880 was £3,000. So these people were not. Ooh. They were well paid, obviously, in their time. But thank you very much. You just did that and flashed it on my screen. But the Jeff Dickens, who lived in the village, as many of us did, through the time of the construction of the bypass, I think he went out every night and recorded the next bit of what happened. And I put them all together into a presentation which we had in the village hall probably 4 or 5 years ago. It may be that I will rerun that one because there's been a lot of interest in his in the comments on his photographs he's posted recently. But if any of you have any particular desires to find out a little bit more about any part of the village, we'll try and assist in finding out. But hopefully, as I say, back in September, we will return to the village hall. And in the meantime, I wish you a very warm, I can't say that, a very pleasant Easter holiday. I'm sorry our Prime Minister hasn't let us be quite as free as we might be, but the opportunity to see friends and family a little bit more relaxed than we have been recently will be good. And again, a huge thank you to Barbara for your talk this evening. I'm sure most of you will be able to see. Yeah.
Well done, Barbara.
Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to you all, and good night.
See you, everyone.
Night.
Bye.
Thank you, Barbara.